A Dorchester County man is set to be executed today for his role in a 2001 murder. The Supreme Court of the United States denied Marian Bowman's stay of execution yesterday, just a day before his scheduled execution. He was convicted
after spending 20 years on death row for a crime he claimed he never committed. Marian Bowman Jr. said his sentence was racially motivated. At the end of the day, a white girl was gone, and he, a poor black man from South Carolina, was the one they decided had to pay. He said the system never cared to listen to his version of events. The prosecutors wanted a conviction, not the truth. His lawyers told him to plead guilty, but he refused, because in his words, "I didn't kill Kandee." On January 31, 2025, South Carolina executed him by lethal injection. But up until his final breath, Marian Bowman maintained his innocence. He said he was punished not for what he did, but for who he was. To understand how a man ended up spending 2 decades on death row insisting on his innocence, and why some people still believe him even after his death, we have to go back to how it all began. Back to February 16, 2001, in Dorchester County, South Carolina, where 21-year-old Kandee Louise Martin was found dead inside the burned trunk of her car. What happened that night would ignite a controversy that still divides people today. This is the story of Marian Bowman Jr., the man executed for the murder of a woman he swore he didn't kill. There are 2 versions of this story, and they couldn't be more different. One told by the state of South Carolina, the version that put a man on death row, and the other told by the man they executed, Marian Bowman Jr., who maintained, until his dying breath, that he was innocent. To truly understand this case, we have to start with Bowman's version, his truth, as he called it. A story that begins not with murder, but with addiction, poverty, and survival in a small South Carolina town. It was Friday, February 16, 2001. Marian was just 20 years old, a young black man from Branchville trying to make a living the only way he knew how, selling drugs. His family was poor, and he had dropped out of high school years before. He'd been in and out of trouble, mostly petty crimes, but this day would change his life forever. That morning, he said, started like any other. He woke up early and asked his little sister, Yolanda, to drop him off at a friend's place, the Villa Apartments. On the way, they picked up his cousin, James Lil Gap Gadsden. They hung around the apartments for a while, smoking, laughing, and trying to make a little money. Then, a familiar face appeared. A silver Ford Escort pulled up, and behind the wheel was Kandee Martin, a white woman he'd known since elementary school. She was 21, pretty, lively, but deeply troubled. Kandee was addicted to crack, and Bowman admitted that he was one of her suppliers. He said their relationship was complicated. Sometimes friends, sometimes more than that. She'd even stayed at his house before when she had nowhere else to go. According to Bowman, Kandee honked her horn to get his attention. They talked, laughed, and as usual, she bought some drugs from him. Later, when she ran out of money, she gave him her wristwatch as collateral and promised to come back after picking up her check. Bowman said he pocketed the watch and didn't think much of it, but that was the last time he saw her alive. At least, that's what he believed at the time. As the day went on, Bowman said he stopped by Frankie Martin's house, no relation to Kandee, to collect some money. There, he said, Kandee showed up again. They talked, and eventually, they hooked up. Afterward, she offered to give him a ride back to the apartments. She told him she wanted to see his cousin Gap before heading home. Bowman said she seemed calm, not afraid, not upset, just tired. When she saw Gap, she asked him to come along for a short drive. Bowman watched them leave together. He said that was around 7 p.m. An hour later, he said Gap came back, driving Kandee's car. Bowman asked where she was, but Gap brushed it off, saying he'd dropped her somewhere. He looked nervous, though. Quiet. Not his usual self. Later that night, Gap came to Bowman's house again, still in Kandee's car, and asked him to drive to the club since Bowman had a valid driver's license. Bowman refused at first, but eventually agreed. He said there were roadblocks that night, and Gap was worried about getting stopped. When they got to the club, Bowman said things seemed off. People were arguing, someone flashed a gun, and chaos broke out. Gunshots rang out, and they ran. Bowman said he drove some of his friends home afterward. It was during that drive, he claimed, that Gap turned to him and said something that froze his blood. "Kandee's dead." Bowman said he didn't believe it, thought it was some sick joke. But Gap didn't laugh. He didn't explain either. He just went quiet. When Bowman got home, he said he couldn't sleep. Something didn't feel right. The next morning, police showed up at his door. They said they'd found a burned-out car in Dorchester County, and inside the trunk was the body of Kandee Martin. Bowman said he was stunned. He told police he had nothing to do with it, that the last time he saw Kandee, she was alive, driving off with Gap. But investigators didn't believe him. They searched his house, and the only thing they found was Kandee's watch, the one she'd given him earlier that day. That, along with the testimony of his cousin and a few others, would later seal his fate. Bowman said the case against him was built on lies, threats, and deals made behind closed doors. He claimed the police coerced witnesses, that they threatened to lock up his family unless they testified against him. He said his own lawyers failed him, that they refused to investigate the video showing someone else buying gas right before the car was set on fire. Even worse, he said, they ignored the confession of Ricky Davis, a man who swore that Gap had confessed to killing Kandee while in jail. Bowman said the jury never heard that, nor did they hear that one witness, the same man who testified against him, was caught bragging about getting away with murder. By the time the jury convicted him, Bowman said the outcome was already written. A white girl was dead, a poor black man was on trial, and the town wanted justice, any kind of justice. He was sentenced to death, while the others, including the cousin he accused of being the real killer, walked free within a few years. For more than 2 decades, Bowman sat on death row, writing letters, filing appeals, and telling anyone who would listen that he didn't do it. But every appeal failed, every plea was ignored, and on January 31st, 2025, the state of South Carolina ended his life. But his final words were the same ones he'd repeated for 24 years. "I didn't kill Kandee." The prosecutors told a very different story, one that painted Marian Bowman as a violent drug dealer who murdered Kandee Martin in cold blood after an argument over money and drugs spiraled out of control. In their version, Kandee wasn't just another customer. She was a desperate addict who often traded sex for cocaine and meth. Her relationship with Bowman was toxic. They said he controlled her, kept her hooked, and when she couldn't pay, he'd threaten or humiliate her. According to the state, on the night of February 15, 2001, Kandee showed up at Bowman's place, high and frantic. She owed him money for drugs, and he wanted payment. She promised to get it, but he didn't believe her. Witnesses claimed they saw her crying as she left his trailer that night, the last time anyone saw her alive. Hours later, a loud explosion echoed through a wooded area in Dorchester County. Firefighters found a burning car engulfed in flames. Inside the trunk, they discovered a charred body, later identified as 21-year-old Kandee Martin. Her wrists were bound, her skull fractured, and her body had been doused in gasoline. The crime was brutal, and it shocked the quiet South Carolina town. Investigators quickly turned their eyes on Bowman. He was one of the last people seen with Kandee. They claimed he had scratches on his arm, traces of gasoline on his clothes, and no alibi for that night. When police searched his home, they said they found Kandee's hair in his car and blood on his carpet. But that was just the beginning. The prosecution's star witness, James "Gap" Gadsden, Bowman's cousin, told investigators that Bowman confessed to him. He said Bowman showed up at his house in the middle of the night, panicked and sweating, saying, "I had to do it. She was going to snitch." According to Gadsden, Bowman feared Kandee might tell police about his drug business. He said Bowman beat her to death in a fit of rage, stuffed her body in her car, and set it on fire to destroy evidence. That single testimony sealed his fate. Even though Gadsden himself was facing drug and gun charges, prosecutors made a deal with him, reduced time in exchange for his cooperation. To the jury, that didn't matter. They saw a violent man, a drug dealer, a poor black man accused of killing a white woman. The image was enough. The state built their narrative carefully, brick by brick. They showed photos of the burned car, the autopsy results, and fragments of what they claimed were Bowman's fingerprints on the gas can found near the scene. They said the motive was simple: greed, rage, and fear of being exposed. The prosecutor, during closing arguments, pointed directly at Bowman and said, "This man didn't just kill Kandee Martin, he erased her." It was powerful, emotional, and for the jury it was convincing. The courtroom was silent as the verdict was read. Guilty of murder, guilty of arson, guilty of obstruction. The death penalty was the only sentence they believed fit the crime, but even then, not everyone was convinced. Some people questioned why there was no direct physical evidence linking Bowman to the killing. No DNA, no eyewitness, no confession. Others wondered why the state relied so heavily on a single witness who had everything to gain by lying. Back to when the body was found. In the early hours of February 17, 2001, less than 24 hours after the charred body of 21-year-old Kandee Louise Martin was discovered in the trunk of her burning car, police knocked at the door of 20-year-old Marian Bowman Jr.'s home. He woke to flashing lights, a search of his property, the news that his friend was dead, and the beginning of a case that would span more than 2 decades. The only significant item found during the search on that day, Bowman later insisted, was the wristwatch that Kandee had given him the previous afternoon as collateral for drugs. His house, he claimed, revealed nothing else linking him to the crime scene. From that moment, Bowman says his life changed. Before the trial began, he was offered multiple deals by the prosecution in order to avoid a death sentence. According to his handwritten statement, he was told he could plead guilty and receive life without parole, 13 times. His attorneys in the state tried to convince him just plead guilty. But Bowman refused. He maintained, "I didn't kill anyone." He wrote, "The solicitor asked me to plead guilty because I was a black man and the victim was a white girl. He said he'd love this." He testified later that he would rather take his case to trial than admit guilt for a crime he claimed he didn't commit. As the trial approached, the prosecution built its case around 2 key cooperating witnesses, Gap and Travis Felder. Both men had been charged with offenses related to the murder, and both received favorable resolutions in exchange for their testimonies. Gap ultimately received a 20-year sentence for misprision of felony and accessory after the fact, while Felder received a sentence of 3 years suspended and probation after his testimony. According to Bowman's version and defense motion filings, Gap testified that he witnessed Bowman pull the trigger, drag Kandee's body into the woods, and later set her car ablaze, telling Gap not to say anything. Felder's testimony described driving Kandee's car to the burn site and helping park it. But Bowman's legal team argued both witnesses were deeply compromised. They were given deals, faced significant pressure, and one witness, Ricky Davis, claimed Gap confessed to him about killing Kandee, a statement which the jury never heard. Meanwhile, Bowman alleges that members of his own family, his sister, father, and others, were arrested and charged as accessories to the murder, not necessarily because they were suspect, but as leverage. In his statement, he claims the prosecution threatened them with long prison terms unless they testified against him. He argued that the process was coercion rather than justice. On May 17, 2002, the trial began in Dorchester County before a St. George jury. The defense raised concerns about witness credibility, the plea deals, and gaps in the physical evidence. But the prosecution emphasized the narrative: a black male, a white female victim, drugs, anger, and fire. Within 3 hours of deliberation, the jury found Bowman guilty of murder and third-degree arson. On May 24, 2002, the jury recommended the death penalty unanimously for the murder charge, and Bowman was sentenced accordingly. 10 years were imposed for the arson count. During sentencing and post-conviction proceedings, Bowman's lawyers argued that his trial counsel failed to present mitigating evidence, including Kandee's known addiction, prostitution allegations, and the key video showing someone else fueling gas at the burn site before the fire. They claimed the attorney deliberately avoided these issues because he feared offending the jury by implying the victim was a white girl who prostituted for drugs. The case has become a focal point of controversy. Was the conviction secured by reliable evidence, or by incentivized testimonials and race-biased defense strategy? The fact that Gap testified against Bowman, got a shorter sentence while Bowman faced death, that Felder walked away with probation, that family members were threatened, all raise questions. For Bowman, the trial was never just about truth. He says it was about controversy survival in a system that saw him as disposable. After the sentence was read aloud, the courtroom fell silent. The jury had spoken. Marian Bowman Jr. was to die by lethal injection. Bowman stood still, expressionless, as the reality of his fate settled in. He had been found guilty of murdering 21-year-old Kandee Louise Martin and burning her body inside her car. The same jury that convicted him had unanimously recommended death. The judge read the sentence without emotion, and Bowman, a 22-year-old black man from Branchville, South Carolina, was led away in shackles, his wrists cuffed tightly behind his back. As the crowd began to disperse, Bowman's family wept quietly. His mother fainted as deputies escorted her out. Reporters described the scene as a moment that split the town, because while some believed justice had been served for Kandee, others whispered that Bowman had never stood a chance. From the courthouse, Bowman was transported to Broad River Correctional Institution, the state's most secure facility and home to South Carolina's death row. There, he was stripped of his street clothes, handed a prison jumpsuit, and locked inside a tiny cell measuring barely the length of a twin bed. The walls were cold concrete. The air smelled of steel and disinfectant. It was a place meant to break men down slowly. In letters he would later write from prison, Bowman described his first night on death row as the longest night of my life. He claimed that even then, he still believed the truth would come out, that someone, somewhere, would uncover the lies that had put him there. But as the weeks turned to months and the months into years, Bowman's hope began to fade. Appeals were filed and rejected. Every request for a new trial was denied. Yet Bowman never changed his story. He said he was innocent, that the real killer had struck a deal, and that the state refused to see past his skin color. I didn't kill Kandee, he wrote. But to them, a white girl was dead, and someone had to pay. For over 20 years, Bowman waited in that narrow cell, counting the days, writing letters, and preparing himself for the inevitable. And on January 31st, 2025, after 2 decades of appeals, the state carried out the sentence it had promised him. It was Thursday, January 30th, 2025, Marian Bowman Jr.'s final full day alive. After more than 2 decades on South Carolina's death row, time had finally run out. The courts had denied his final appeals. The governor had refused to intervene. Bowman knew that within 24 hours he would be led into the death chamber. He spent most of that morning writing a letter to his daughter, a short poem, and a statement he wanted his lawyer to read during the execution. In that statement, Bowman again insisted he was innocent. I did not kill Kandee Martin, it began. I'm innocent of the crimes I'm here to die for. He refused to ask Governor Henry McMaster for mercy, saying it would make no difference. The governor later released a statement confirming he had reviewed Bowman's case and would not grant clemency. That night, Bowman was given his final meal: fried seafood, shrimp, fish, and oysters, with chicken wings, onion rings, banana pudding, German chocolate cake, and 2 small cups of juice. He ate quietly, saving a few bites for later. The next morning, January 31st, the atmosphere at Broad River Correctional Institution was heavy. Outside the prison gates, protesters began to gather. Some held signs reading, "Innocence Matters" and "Stop State Killings." Others simply prayed. Among them was Heather Heckman from Columbia, who leaned against the chain-link fence in silence. As 6 p.m. approached, the small crowd began to sing "Amazing Grace," Bowman's favorite hymn. Inside the death house, Bowman was calm. He had chosen lethal injection over electrocution or firing squad. The execution team entered his cell at 5:40 p.m. They shackled his wrists and ankles and escorted him to the chamber. Reporters and official witnesses watched through thick glass as he was strapped to the gurney. At exactly 6 p.m., the curtain opened. Bowman, wearing a green jumpsuit, turned his head toward his attorney, Boyd Young, and nodded slightly. Young began to read Bowman's final statement, a mix of confession, poetry, and plea for understanding. Bowman kept his eyes closed, his face tilted toward the ceiling. "We are not what the state labels us to be," Young read aloud. "We are kind, caring, loving people, and it's a shame the world can't see that." Members of Kandee Martin's family, legally allowed to attend, were not present. Only Bowman's attorney, a representative from the solicitor's office, and several reporters filled the witness room. At 6:04 p.m., the warden gave the signal. The lethal drugs began to flow. Bowman took several deep breaths, heavy, deliberate, the kind of breaths that echo through the chamber. His chest rose and fell sharply for a few seconds, then slowed. At 6:06 p.m., his chest stopped moving. For 20 long minutes, there was silence. Finally, At 6:26 p.m., a doctor entered the room, checked for a pulse, and placed a stethoscope on his chest. A voice came through the intercom. The execution has been carried out. Marian Bowman Jr. was pronounced dead at 6:27 p.m. Outside, the crowd stopped singing. A few held hands in prayer, others wept. Reporters sent out the first breaking news alerts. Inside the prison, guards began the routine cleanup. The same cold procedure they had practiced for years, but never gotten used to. Bowen was the third inmate executed since South Carolina resumed executions after a 13-year hiatus, caused by the state's inability to obtain lethal injection drugs. He was also the first to publicly refuse clemency, saying, "They don't want truth, they want closure." As his body was removed from the chamber, one guard whispered, "He went out calm." For some, it was justice served. For others, it was a final act of injustice, the execution of a man who claimed innocence until his last breath. And now, after 24 years of appeals, protests, and unanswered questions, the story of Marian Bowman Jr. has finally come to an end, though the controversy surrounding his guilt may never die.